Hi everyone, welcome to today's webinar. Our topic today is load defection, how solar plus storage will change the world. And this webinar is a presentation of the Resilient Power Project, which is a project of Clean Energy Group. And we have guest speakers with us today from Rocky Mountain Institute. And our host for this webinar will be Todd Olinsky-Paul. Todd is a project director here at Clean Energy Group. And before we get started, I'd like to go over a few quick housekeeping notes. All of our participants today are in listen-only mode. This means that while you can hopefully hear us, we cannot hear you. And you have a couple of options for tuning into the audio portion of this webinar. You can either use your computer mic and speakers, or you can use a telephone to call in, and you should have some instructions on your webinar console for doing that. A very important note, we encourage all of our webinar participants to please submit your questions as you think of them throughout the webinar by typing them into the question box on your webinar console and hitting send. We will queue up all of your questions and answer them as time allows at the end of our presentations today, so please do submit them as you think of them, and that gets you a better chance of having your question answered. A final note, this webinar is being recorded. You will find a recording of this webinar as well as all of our previous Resilient Power Project webinars on our website at the web address that you see on your screen. And with that, I will pass this over to our host, Todd Olinsky-Paul. Todd?
Okay, thank you very much, Samantha. This is Todd Olinsky-Paul with Clean Energy Group and Clean Energy States Alliance, and I would like to welcome everybody to the webinar. It is a very, looking to be a very well-attended webinar, so I'll just say this now and probably repeat it again later. If you have a question or comment that you would like to make, please type it in early. Don't wait until the end of the presentation, because while the presenters are speaking, I will be sorting through those questions and comments and then asking them during the question period. So it'd be nice to get those in early if you think of them early. I want to do a brief background introduction of who we are, and then I will introduce the topic and speakers. This is a webinar of Clean Energy Group's Resilient Power Project. This is a foundation-supported project. You can see on your screen the names of some of the foundations. Next slide, please. Basically, the Resilient Power Project was started in the wake of Superstorm Sandy, when a number of northeastern states came to us looking for help to put together resilient power solutions so that when the next storm hit, they would not be left in the dark, or at least their critical facilities would not be left in the dark. So the goal of the project is to significantly increase public and private investment in clean, resilient power systems and support states, municipalities, and communities in doing so. We offer technical assistance and policy and program support. We focus on affordable housing and other facilities that serve low-income communities and low-income residents of the communities. And we work with developers as well, and basically we do these webinars as a way to get information out about resilient power technologies. We tend to focus on solar and storage as a technology, and that's in fact the focus of today's webinar. Next slide, please. I'm going to introduce the speakers now. They are both from Rocky Mountain Institute, and we're very happy to have them today. We have Leia Guccione and Jesse Morris. Leia is a manager with RMI's Electricity and Industrial Practices, where she specializes in microgrids, campus energy systems, industrial ecosystems, distributed generation and storage, and renewable energy procurement strategies. And she's also manager of RMI's Electricity Innovation Lab. She heads RMI's research on the disruptive potential of distributed solar PV deployed in concert with distributed battery storage, and her team produced the Economics of Grid Defection, an earlier report, and the sequel report, the Economics of Load Defection, which is the topic of today's webinar. I also would like to introduce Jesse Morris, also a manager at RMI's Electricity and Transportation Practices area. He's involved in RMI's Disruptor program, where he works with energy storage companies, smart control providers, utilities, and the regulatory community to help distributed energy resources become an integral and widely accessible part of the global electricity system. He's also working with his team to explore the value proposition behind more flexible residential and commercial building loads that result from different combinations of solar PV, smart controls, variable speed devices, thermal storage, and electrical storage. So if we could go to the next slide, please. I want to just cue this up by saying that we did have almost exactly a year ago a webinar. I believe Leia was speaking on that one as well, on RMI's previous report on grid defection. And at that time, the sort of catchphrase at the moment was the utility death spiral, which was predicted to occur as more and more people installed PV and storage devices and then disconnected from their utility providers. This current report follows on that previous report and looks at what's probably a much more likely scenario, which is that people will remain connected to the grid, but will supplement grid purchased electricity with self-generated electricity, and with the addition of storage devices, we'll be able to do that very efficiently and effectively, potentially also reducing other costs that they might incur from, for example, demand charges, and potentially even, making additional revenue from these systems. So, having said that, I will I will pass this over to today's speakers, and I just want to urge everyone once again, please get your questions in early, and we'll get to as many of them as we can at the end of the presentation. So with that, Leia, please take it away.
Thanks, Todd. I appreciate the very thoughtful introduction, and attendees, it's my pleasure to have this opportunity to speak with you today. And as Todd mentioned, I'm joined by my colleague, Jesse Morris, as well, who will be speaking in the latter part of the presentation. So for those of you who are not familiar with Rocky Mountain Institute, a few notes about RMI. Sorry, there's some lag time on the slides. Rocky Mountain Institute is a nonprofit, nonpartisan think and do tank. We're centered here in Colorado. We were founded in 1982 by well-known scientist Amory Lovins. But one of the things that's very unique about the way RMI works with the industry is we really look to cross institutional boundaries, working with business, government, academia, and all sectors of industry to look at how we can take a whole systems integrated approach to driving down the costs and barriers around energy efficiency and renewable energy. And core to our work and our mission and our beliefs is the belief that nothing will drive these technologies to scale faster than businesses and other organizations investing and adopting these technologies, because it's in their best interest to do so, and often because it's in their best business sense to do so. So it shouldn't be very much of a surprise to most of the attendees on the call that the price of solar PV and the price of battery technologies are declining. And they're declining quite considerably. And part of that is driven by the increased adoption and deployment of these technologies. Residential and commercial solar deployment in the U.S. is up and has been for the last nearly a decade. And thanks to electric vehicle sales, battery manufacturing and battery development is also growing rapidly. And these two forces are creating a unique opportunity to couple these technologies together, solar with batteries. And for a long time, many had only hypothesized that these two technologies might decline in cost sufficiently that customers might actually start to consider replacing traditional retail service with some kind of solar battery solution. And We liked that hypothesis, but we wanted more than that. And that's what drove us to do our first report on the economics of grid defection, is when we looked out there, there was really no rigorous analysis around the real economic potential for solar and batteries together to disrupt traditional retail electric service. And so what we sought to do was to establish a fact base showing exactly where and when these technologies together could economically provide an alternative to customers, giving them the option to leave the grid entirely. And we thought this approach was particularly significant because for more than decades, for almost a century, the utility business model has been very much premised on the assumption that their customers will always be there and they will always be only their customers. And the reality is that the declining costs and improving performance of solar and battery technologies is creating new options for customers. And we really wanted to understand, could and would customers set the pace of distributed energy resource adoption? And so an important thing to note with all the slides that I'm going to show you is that we didn't assume any special incentives or discounts for these technologies. We assume that the investment tax credit expires at the end of 2016. We didn't include any state incentives in our cost analyses. And we also didn't include any kind of net energy metering in the scenarios where we looked at grid-connected systems. And what we found was pretty interesting, is we looked at 5 geographies that we thought painted a great picture of the electricity landscape in the U.S. And we found that there absolutely is going to be a date when solar and battery technologies come down in cost, giving customers a real option to leave the grid and provide themselves with grid equivalent reliability. But one of the things that surprised us was how close this possibility really was in certain geographies. And so what you can see here are the base case results of our initial analysis on fully off-grid solar battery systems. But we wanted to consider some other things that are very likely to change, or that customers might consider when they look to adopt a solar plus battery hybrid system. And so in addition to our base case, we looked at 3 further cases. We looked at a case that we call demand-side improvement, where customers couple their investment with energy efficiency and demand-side management in addition to the solar plus battery system. We looked at a scenario where costs come down faster than most people were projecting. And at the time, we looked at the aggressive cost targets of companies like Tesla and the aggressive solar cost targets of the DOE's Sunshot Initiative. And then we looked at the sort of perfect storm scenario, the combined improvement scenario, where customers invest in efficiency as well as technologies that come down in cost faster than anticipated. And what we found is that in some of the most populous parts of the U.S., these totally off-grid solar plus battery systems will become economic for most customers within the next decade. And part of why we think this is so particularly significant is partially illustrated here by the reaction of the finance industry that came out subsequent to our first report. And the reality is that the utility business model has been predicated on the opportunity to recover investments over long periods of time from a captive customer audience. And the reality is that solar plus battery technologies are changing the options for that audience who's not necessarily going to be captive anymore. And we really wanted utilities to wake up to the reality that these technologies are forcing and bringing to a brink the need to change the traditional business model. And as you can see, a lot of the finance industry agreed with us. Now, we'll be the first to tell you that full defection from the grid is actually a really suboptimal scenario. And when we came out with the initial report on grid defection, it wasn't our intention in any way to suggest that customers should fully defect from the grid, but more so to show utilities and regulators that these technologies are presenting a real and near disruption to the industry that needs a real response. But what we found is the thing that's actually a more likely possibility than full grid defection is customers who want to invest in a solar plus battery system while remaining connected to the grid. And what's interesting in this grid connected scenario is that with the grid as a third asset in your system, you're able to more optimally size the solar plus battery configuration, which means that it's going to cost less, which also means that there's sort of less risks because you have a third asset in your generation mix. And we think that means that customers are going to be more likely to adopt and invest in these grid-connected systems. And uniquely, when a customer does this and remains grid-connected, now you've created an opportunity for the utility or the system operator to leverage that distributed asset that the customer has installed for themselves. And so we really wanted to understand the economic potential for customers who invest in these grid-connected systems. But what you realize when you start to consider this scenario is that there's actually a spectrum within this spectrum of ways that customers may want to use solar plus batteries to complement traditional retail service. And what we recognize is that customers will likely navigate this spectrum from using their on-site distributed assets as some kind of backup to the grid to a point in the future when solar and battery costs come down sufficiently to actually using the grid as a backup to their solar plus battery system. So understanding how customers navigate this spectrum and how these economics evolve was really the focus of our most recent work on load defection. So we decided to use the same exact geographies that we considered in our first report on grid defection. What we wanted to look at was where is this going to happen first, where is this going to happen last, and what are the interesting places in between. And so you can see we have 5 geographies that vary both in the climate, the solar irradiation, and the nature of the market structure where those cities reside. And then rate structure actually became a very important consideration when looking at grid-connected systems. When you're analyzing totally off-grid systems, the rate structure doesn't really make a difference because you're not using the grid. But when a customer has a distributed resource that they're using and remains connected to the grid, the rate structure is actually a very important consideration. And since we couldn't model every single possible rate structure, what we sought to do was to model what we consider to be the most common rate structures in use today. And so for residential customers, that's a purely volumetric energy charge. And then for commercial customers, we looked at a 3-part rate that includes a small fixed customer charge, a demand charge, and an energy charge. And then using many of the same inputs as we used in our first report on grid defection, we partnered again with the scientists at Homer Energy and used the Homer modeling software to look at the costs of our technologies, their typical performance characteristics, the load profiles for each region, as well as the basic financial assumptions which I mentioned. No extension of the ITC, no state incentives, and no net energy metering. And used Homer to develop our results, particularly levelized cost of energy, net present value, and some other technical performance specifications around the size of the system. And so from our modeling, one of the first things we were able to develop is this graph here, which is showing you for both residential and commercial customers how the economically optimal system configuration changes with time. And what you can see is that the optimal system evolved from being just the grid to being the grid with solar to a system that's the grid with solar with battery. And you can see that every geography transitions through this same evolution. It happens at a different rate, and that has a lot to do with the nature of the rates in those areas. Hawaii has very expensive electricity, which makes solar plus battery systems economical for those customers today. In places like Louisville, it will happen later because they have such a low retail rate at present. And then, as I alluded to previously, as this optimal system configuration changes, so will the customer's use of the grid. And what you can see here is residential on the left and commercial on the right. And the colored bars are showing what fraction of the customer's energy load is being served by their solar plus battery system. And the gray portion of the bars are showing what portion of the customer's load do they continue to serve with the grid. And as you can see, in all locations, as the cost of solar plus battery systems decline, the customer's dependence on the grid decreases over time. And in many locations in our outer years, 2040 and beyond, the use of the grid declines to less than 10% of the customer's total energy needs. So similar to the consequences of grid defection, the potential magnitude of load defection from utilities has some really threatening consequences to utilities. And what we found was that if you look at the total megawatt hours and total dollar value of load that could defect from the grid, is that by 2030 in places like the Northeast, you could have as many as 58 million megawatt hours that customers would defect from the grid, preferring to serve that load with their own DER assets. This would equate to $15 billion a year in annual utility revenues, and by 2030, it's 50% of residential customers in the Northeast that would find economic advantage in using some kind of solar or solar plus battery hybrid to complement their retail service. And once again, I just want to iterate that that is without any kind of export compensation. And then if you look at the commercial customers, the story is about the same. By 2030, 83 million megawatt hours could be taken off the grid with distributed solar plus battery systems. That'd be $19 billion a year in annual revenues, and 60% of commercial customers by 2030 that would find economic favor in having some kind of distributed solar battery system complementing their grid service. So one thing that's important to note is that our initial study came out on April 7th. And as many of you are probably aware, on April 30th, a certain automaker came out with a pretty significant announcement. And so we took Tesla's announcement and reported price for systems like the Powerwall as well as their utility scale product and revisited our own numbers that we used in our analysis. And what we found was that the price of the Tesla systems brings our cost estimates forward by fully 7 years. And when you look at this spectrum again, this means that the most populous parts of the U.S., most customers will find it to be advantageous to have a solar plus battery system by 2022, less than 10 years away, and very close at hand. So many times when we talk about the adoption of solar plus battery technologies and other distributed resources, this conversation about net metering comes up. And it's often suggested that reducing or removing net energy metering or export compensation is one way to reduce potential load defection from the grid. And what you can see here is that, I should back up. Because we know this conversation is happening, we did some specific analysis where we did consider net metering in the scenarios, and we looked at how the economics of a system with net metering changes the total economics of the system, and in particular also changes the configuration of the system, which I'll show you in a moment. But what you can see is the total net dependence on the grid for a customer with net metering is the dotted line. And so you can see that today with net metering, a customer, their net dependence on the grid is going to decline almost to zero if they're doing what's in their best economic interest. But even if you were to remove net metering, while you might delay the quote-unquote defection of load from the grid, you're not going to prevent it because the declining cost of solar plus batteries are aggressive enough that just for energy savings alone, customers will start to meet their own energy needs, even if they're not compensated for any export power that they provide back to the grid. Something that's important to note, as I mentioned, is with net metering or some kind of other compensation or incentive, this actually has a really big impact on the configuration of the system. And what you can see here is for a residential customer in Westchester, New York, how the system configuration changes over time. For a customer that is offered export compensation with net metering, that's what's on your right, or for a customer that's not given export compensation, and that's the customer on your left. And what becomes very obvious is that with net metering, a customer never has incentive to invest in a battery ever. These results were similar for all of the geographies that we looked at and also for almost all of the customer classes. So with building on what we found in grid defection and what we see in our analysis of the potential for load defection, we think that the industry is really and truly at a fork in the road, where right now prevailing utility business models and policies are incenting customers to move towards grid defection, where it's generally in their best interest to take their energy needs into their own hands and effectively start to insulate and isolate themselves from the cost of the grid. But we think that there's absolutely a path where customer interests and the interests of utilities, grid and system operators, and third parties can actually be better aligned. And that customers still acting in their own interests will invest in systems in a way that those systems can be used to make the grid more reliable and more efficient, rather than using those systems just to take themselves off the grid. But moving to this integrated grid really requires us to evolve our rate structures, change utility business models, and change regulatory structures such that it is in the customer's interest to become part of an integrated grid and not to increasingly remove themselves from the grid. And so it's important that decision makers are asking themselves today, am I making choices that are leading me towards this integrated grid, or are my defensive tactics potentially going to move towards grid defection in the long run? So as I mentioned, we see three key levers of action towards an integrated grid. The first is really evolving prices and rate structures and showing and creating rate structures that reflect both the true costs of the system and the true value that distributed energy resources can provide back to the system. So this looks like a lot more locationally specific pricing, as well as more time-varying rates and certain rate structures that have better signals around power attributes like reactive power support. The second thing is new business models. We really need to look beyond the age-old utility business model where the utility builds more to earn more. And we need to start looking at future utility business models that allow for different ownership of assets and the different provision of services and new revenue streams for utilities that are based on meeting more social goals, not just on building more things. And then the third lever is regulatory structures. Can we evolve our regulatory environment and processes to ensure that DERs can become a core grid resource and that they can be evaluated and treated with equal footing in the designing, planning, operating, and maintaining of a future grid system? So these are our kind of three focus areas in a lot of our work. And building on this, I'd like to pass control of the presentation to my colleague, Jesse Morris, who will talk to you a bit about how we've been looking at batteries and the value of batteries specifically.
Thanks, Leia. This is Jesse Morris, also with Rocky Mountain Institute, and we're going to take just about 10 minutes to look at the batteries under the load defection analysis with a little bit more of an edge, and to look at what else they can do for the system. So let me make sure I have control here.
If you click on the viewing screen on your webinar console, that should activate it.
And it looks like it's not letting me swap. There it goes. Okay, great. So essentially, the systems that Leia was just talking through, that they were providing a primary service to the residential and commercial customers under the load defection analysis. Those batteries were increasing the amount of solar self-consumption in those buildings as a response to the rate structure that they modeled for the load defection report. What's interesting is if you look at the batteries themselves, those systems that were increasing the amount of solar that's self-consumed for those buildings are only being used for something like 5 to 50% of their useful life. So that means that the battery is available to deliver a number of other grid services to the customer and the grid for the rest of its useful life.
Excuse me, Jesse. I'm sorry to interrupt. This is Todd. The slide I'm seeing is blank, and I'm getting a lot of people writing in saying that there's a problem, that they're not seeing a slide.
So everyone hold on for 1 second.
Is it supposed to be blank?
It is. I will animate in 1 moment here, but thanks, Todd.
Okay, so everybody relax. There will be a visual portion of the slide. Thank you. Go ahead.
So we have a new report coming out that looks at this called the Economics of Energy Storage. And in it, we explore 3 questions. 1, what services can storage deliver to the system? 2, how do those services stack? And 3, how does the relative value of those services change depending on where storage is deployed on the grid? So first for this report, we break the grid into 3 different levels. Transmission level, and this is very simplistic, so bear with me. Transmission level, distribution level, and behind the meter. And we look at how the value of storage shifts depending on where you put the battery. Now, in addition to that, we looked at what services can be delivered using energy storage. And we thought about, well, where does the lion's share of each of those services accrue? And who does it accrue to? So we split it into another 3 levels. We said there are customer services that storage can deliver. This is where the load defection systems sit. You have batteries performing 2 things on there, self-consumption and reducing demand charges for commercial customers. We also know that batteries deployed behind the meter can provide a number of utility services, as outlined here, and they can also deliver a number of services to ISOs and RTOs. Think of ancillary services. Now, the big thing with this confusing framework I'm showing right here is that all of these services, you can't deliver all of them as you move further up in the electricity system. So, for example, with those gray pieces I just put up on the slide, you're not able, obviously, to deliver those customer services, most notably backup power, as you move upstream in the electricity system. So using this kind of framework, we said, okay, if you can deploy the highest number of services behind the meter in the electricity system, what's the value of doing that? So we did a big meta study to look at all the different reports out there summarizing the potential value of energy storage to the electricity system. And we again split those services outlined on this slide into 3 different stakeholder groups and who receive the lion's share of the benefit of that service. If there's one thing to take home from this slide, it's that the spread in the value of storage is very large. So we looked at this and said, well, we're not going to be able to generalize the value of storage, so we've got to do some modeling here for this report. So that's what we've done. I'm going to share some results from our modeling, but first I'd like to explain exactly what we did. We built a simplified dispatch model just to illustrate what the net value is of the behind-the-meter energy storage system, like the ones in load defection, that are centered on delivery of both a primary service that then is backed up by a stack of secondary services. And I'd like to just explain what that means. So first, in our model, we take a battery or a fleet of batteries deployed behind the meter, and we assign a primary storage application. So each device is going to be told that this is your primary application. The system's always going to be able to deliver that service at a specific point in time. Some examples of that, the systems in load defection that Leia was presenting on, those would be primarily delivering self-consumption to make sure those batteries are increasing the amount of self-consumption by the building. But then after the battery has delivered that primary service, we assign a stack of secondary services to the battery. So we say, when you're not doing your primary service, do these other things. We don't dispatch the battery to do these services on economic value. Instead, we do it manually because, again, we're just trying to show what batteries deployed behind the meter can do for the system. So, and we use some time-dependent historic market prices to understand the revenue from these services, and there's some examples. We get the batteries to deliver ancillary services, perhaps time-of-use management, or even backup power. A couple of high-level assumptions we made that for anyone on this webinar that is really into batteries, they may raise their eyebrows at. So the first thing is we assumed that there would be no regulatory barriers to aggregated, behind-the-meter market participation or revenue generation. A lot of the services I just showed, frequency regulation as an example, there's only a few places in the U.S. right now where a battery deployed behind the meter can actually get paid for frequency regulation. For the purposes of this exercise, we suspended that reality to say, if legally these batteries could do all of these services, what would the net benefit be to the owners of the system and to the grid? We also assign, and this is of particular note for the Resilient Power Project, and for anyone on here that's thinking about backup power, we actually assign zero value to it for the purposes of this. We have a predetermined dispatch strategy. Again, we're not using an optimization algorithm. We're actually just dispatching the battery manually. And here are, we dispatch it for a minimum of 1 hour, and there are our cost assumptions, $500 per kilowatt hour, and we assign all the cost of power electronics to the battery system itself. Very conservative assumptions. So all I'm going to do, we do 4 cases in this report that's going to be out in a month, but I'd like to just review 2 cases with you very quickly. Here's the first case. Folks on this call have probably heard of the Brooklyn Queens Demand Management Program in New York. For those of you that haven't, this chart's basically explaining what's going on. The dashed red line is the capacity of some existing substations in New York City. In 2018, that substation is projected to be overloaded due to a summer peaking event driven by air conditioning. For this model, and that's the black line that you can see going over the dashed red line. That's where the overload's going to happen. New York has basically said that we're going to spend some of the money that we were going to spend on a transformer upgrade on a suite of distributed energy resources. So we look at that and we say, okay, we're going to assign some of that money to demand response and energy efficiency to make that peak actually be about a 6-hour peak overload event, which is the shaded blue area here. And we say for that 6-hour peak, we're going to deploy a bunch of batteries behind the meter to make it so that those transformers don't need to be replaced. So that is where we're getting this value for deferring the upgrade at the distribution level. Once we do that with the batteries, that's the primary service, we then dispatch those batteries to a number of other services, and I'd like to show you just the results. On the left side, we've got the dollars. Revenue, what are the different sources of revenue that those batteries can extract from the system, and then cost. How much does that whole thing cost? On the right, we just have a simple pie chart showing for the system lifetime, what is the battery dispatching to? I'd like to note 2 things on here. One, as you can see, according to our modeling, this isn't a positive investment from a pure economic perspective. There are a couple of things. The main reason that's happening is because we're using lithium-ion batteries to serve a 6-hour peak in the middle of the summer. That means that this system is dramatically oversized. 2 ways we could make this turn into a positive investment. 1, we could use the actually announced Tesla cost numbers, which we're not using here. 2, we could actually value backup power. Or a 3rd reason, we could use a different battery chemistry that would change the equation. Suffice it to say, you can see the way our model works to just understand revenue and cost for these batteries. The other thing I'd like to note is that these batteries, as you can see on the pie chart, are being dispatched for 1% of their useful life to generate over half of the revenue that is attributable to the system. What that means is that, and this is a general statement, whenever there is a distribution upgrade planned and batteries or other distributed energy resources could be used in lieu of a traditional infrastructure upgrade, it's very attractive economically, and it's something that DERs are quite good at handling. The second case I'd like to show is just a little bit different before we move on to questions. We're going across the country now to California. This one's a little bit more typical of what batteries are being used for now. This building shown on this chart had a load that exceeded about 500 kilowatts. which bumped the customer into a different tariff schedule in PG&E territory. And you can see that by the dashed red line and the red load profile that exceeded that. What we've done is sized a storage system to make sure that a 15-minute peak never exceeds 500 kilowatts, which results in significantly reduced demand charges. So this is a very simple business case for batteries that is being done right now. And on the chart, you can see the load before and after storage and when that battery is charging and discharging. But in addition to performing that service, we then used our model to dispatch that battery to deliver a couple of other grid services, and I'll show the results very similar to the slide before. So now this looks a little bit different. The revenue, most of the revenue from this system is coming from that demand charge reduction, but we also assigned some revenue coming from resource adequacy payments, and then we dispatched the battery into the CAISO market to do load following, regulation, and spinning reserve. So you can see the results here, quite different from the New York case, and this paper, the Economics of Energy Storage, is going to go into 4 cases like this in detail, and we hope it's useful and enlightening for the folks on this webinar. Very briefly, I'm going to just speed through these last 2 slides. We come out with a number of recommendations in this report, but I'd like to move to questions. Just want to flag a couple of things on here. A regulatory recommendation on this slide, the second bullet, require utilities to disaggregate the cost of electricity service across multiple categories. A lot of the modeling that we did with this paper looked at non-restructured states. For example, we look at Arizona. In Arizona, it's impossible to tell how much the utility is planning on spending at a detailed level on distribution infrastructure. It's also impossible to tell or to disaggregate the cost of, for example, ancillary services versus just energy sales. Therefore, it's really hard to understand how much it costs batteries or other distributed energy resources to deliver a stack of services as compared to, for example, a combustion turbine or a traditional distribution system upgrade. So that's a big challenge, and that is a regulatory lever that we would like to see pulled in order to make some of this information available. Finally, a last recommendation I would like to flag, similar to what I just mentioned. We need a widely recognized modeling tool, or at least a methodology that compares on an equal basis things like the batteries that I'm showing here, delivering a stack of services, to those combustion turbines and distribution level investments. We're hearing a lot of calls from both utilities and regulators to have that kind of apples to apples comparison capability, so it's something that this paper is definitely highlighting. So with that, I think before we take questions, Leia, are you going to talk about this last slide?
Certainly. So thanks, Jesse. While Jesse and I just shared with you the work of what was largely internal analysis and research that RMI led that we thought was particularly useful and relevant to the changes and transitions that are happening in the industry. Research isn't the only thing we do at RMI. And ELAB Accelerator is an event that's part of our Electricity Innovation Lab. And one of the things that we're specifically doing at this event is folks like Jesse and I take a week every year to work with project teams that are trying to develop solutions or business models to bring solutions like solar plus battery systems to their community or to their organization. And so we work with teams for almost 4 days to develop new business models or plans for community microgrids or energy innovation districts. Our event for 2016 is going to be happening April 24th to the 27th. And our application process is going to begin in September. Unfortunately, it looks like the website might be getting cut off on the screen. But if you go to RMI's website, which is www.rmi.org, and you follow the links for ELAB, there's a place where you can sign up to receive announcements about ELAB Accelerator. One of the teams, for example, that Jesse worked with last year came from San Diego, where we worked with a utility as well as other battery storage stakeholders to develop a distributed battery business model for that utility. So a really exciting opportunity for those of you who are working on implementing real solutions with these new and exciting technologies. Todd, that's all we've got, so I think we're happy to take questions at this point.
Okay, terrific. And thanks to both of you for an excellent presentation. Before I do this, so we have about 15 minutes. We'll get to as many questions as we possibly can. And to those of you who have asked, yes, the webinars are recorded and archived on our website and accessible later if you want to review them. So one question was regarding the fact that you didn't include any state incentives in the analysis. And obviously you also didn't include things like the federal ITC. So the questioner wants to know, would the economically optimal generation mix potentially be altered if you included various incentives? I mean, I'm assuming the answer to that is yes, but maybe you can fill us in a little bit. Did you do any modeling runs with existing incentives to see, how it contrasted with the strictly economic runs that you did?
Sure, thanks, Todd. This is Leia, and I'll take this and then let Jesse chime in. We didn't, in any of our analysis, look at specific state incentives. The biggest thing that we did was we did, in the load defection work, look at scenarios without net metering and scenarios with net metering, where customers would be compensated for any export of electricity at their retail rate. State incentives absolutely would change the economically optimal system configuration. And one thing that we know in California with the self-generation incentive program credit that's available, there's a lot of applications where a battery alone with that incentive is an economically positive thing to do for a customer. We, as a conservatism, because most of those state incentive programs have caps and shelf life, sought not to include them in our analysis. All of our inputs and assumptions are available in the appendices of both reports, and Homer Energy actually hosts a user group community on their website for both reports for people who want to do the modeling for themselves and include things like different state incentives to see how it affects system configuration and economics. Jesse, do you have anything you want to add?
The only thing I would add is that for the battery-specific work that I presented on, we did not include any incentives either, most noticeably the self-generation incentive program that Leia mentioned. The reason is we're trying to make a different point. If we can unlock unfettered market participation for all behind-the-meter resources, and I just showed you a few revenue streams that those things can tap, then the need for heavy levels of subsidy just isn't there. So it's more about unlocking the participation of these things and less about relying on subsidy.
Okay, great. Thank you. Another person wants to get clarification on one of your slides that shows load defection with and without net metering. The question is, are utility efforts to fight load defection by limiting net metering actually more likely to hasten load defection?
I would say that they're not necessarily going to hasten load defection, but some of the rate structures and compensation mechanisms that utilities are suggesting as alternatives to net metering don't incent customers to build or use a system that could complement the grid. So in particular, what we see is with fixed charges, the less ability that I have as a customer to affect my utility bill with a fixed charge, the more likely I might be in the future when costs become really, really competitive and attractive to just leave the utility entirely. Because I have no way through better use of my system and better management of my energy to affect my bill. But whereas if you have things like real-time pricing or time-of-use pricing, and I can use my system to optimally match my load against a variable rate, then that's something that really does incent me to use my system in a way that's to the better effect of the grid. So that's sort of what we've seen with utilities and some of the decisions they're faced with today. Jesse?
I'll hold off. Let's see if we can get some more questions. Thanks.
Okay, great. So somebody wants to know if you can discuss reducing net metering and increasing demand charges, which are policies that are being considered in some states that have high rates of solar adoption. And can you discuss this in the context of moving toward the more efficient overall solution?
Sure, I'll go first, and then I think Jesse probably has some things to say. So one of the things that we've seen in California, particularly in the last, I think, 2 or 3 weeks, is most of the investor-owned utilities in California just had to submit to the Public Utility Commission what's called their NEM successor tariff, which is what some people casually refer to as NEM 2.0. And many of the utilities did include a demand charge for residential customers. And we do think that a demand charge is a pretty good signal to residential customers that would encourage them to be more sensitive about how much power they use. And this would, for certain residential customers, make a battery a attractive investment for them. What we think is actually just as effective as a residential demand charge is a time of use or real-time pricing charge, because there's a lot of customers. One of the things that there's been a lot of research on in the last about 4 or 5 years is just how different residential customers are. People used to think that all residential customers were generally created equal. They all worked 9-to-5 jobs. They all turned on their ovens and air conditioners at the same time of day. And the great work of institutions like Lawrence Berkeley National Labs and other labs and academic institutions has shown that residential customers in particular are actually much more diverse than we thought. And so one of the things that you potentially lose out on with a residential demand charge is that the customer's peak may not align with system peak that well. And so while a residential demand charge does start to show the customer a signal for better managing their power, we think that having a time-varying element does more to reduce total costs of the system and improve total system efficiency. Jesse, do you have anything you want to add here?
That last comment I would just echo. We're at RMI, as folks probably know, we're massive advocates of time-varying rates and more sophisticated rate design, regardless of the size and shape of the utility or the utility's entire load profile. Demand charges can make some things, like batteries and even more low-cost solutions that get the same result, like smart controls, to better serve the grid's need to flatten out the entire load profile. But moving towards just more time dynamic pricing is probably something you'd get Leia and I on board with before jumping straight to demand charges, although we absolutely recognize the direction that those proposals are going and the intent behind them.
Okay, thanks. Well, since we're talking about time of use and demand charges and net metering, here's a question that I'm not sure I understand, but I'm going to ask it. Hopefully you'll understand it. The questioner says, a key concern about moving toward real-time or time-of-use rate structures is the fact that it makes financing systems exceedingly difficult. What are your thoughts on this?
Interesting. That is a good question. Yeah, so I'm going to assume that question is basically saying the value proposition of net metering from a solar customer is just much easier to understand than having to look at an actual building's load profile and consider, well, is it going to look the same as it does right now years into the future? Because that's my revenue stream, especially if this is a third-party finance system. That is a very good question. I think the answer is that the developers that are out there right now putting solar on people's roofs and putting batteries in their basement, and increasingly, if you ask us, hopefully trying to make loads a little bit more smart for these buildings so they can respond to these more granular rate structures. Yes, looking at it from the outside perspective, it's much harder to understand than just looking at a system that sits on a roof and responds to net metering. However, we have to evolve if we're going to have these more granular rate structures coming online in order to respond to them, and those systems are going to need to be financed in some way, shape, or form. the way you can decrease the risk profile of those buildings is that put more of a diversity of response capability into that building. What I mean is couple solar with things like smart controls, couple solar with things like small amounts of storage to respond. As you make the building level's load more flexible and as you allow third parties or homeowners to control what that load looks like, you're going to decrease the risk profile of that customer to be able to respond to rate structures now and in the future. So simple answer is I think by making those customers' loads more flexible with a combination of PV, smart controls, and batteries, you're going to be able to decrease the risk that comes along with more sophisticated rate structures.
Okay, great. Thank you. Here's another question about ownership. What kind of ownership model did you assume in your calculations? Did you assume customer-owned or third-party owned or some combination, I suppose?
I'll start.
Sure, Todd. I'll take that one.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, go ahead, Jesse.
I'll just very quickly, for the economics of energy storage piece, we assumed that all the systems were third-party owned and were being dispatched by either a scheduling coordinator or a company controlling all of these batteries behind the meter to dispatch them to certain services. So it's third-party.
And then we actually took the opposite tactic in both grid defection and load defection and assumed that the systems would be totally owned by the customer. So both the residential systems and the commercial systems, we interpreted those as being owned by the customer and then accounted for the capture of the investment tax credit or depreciation accordingly. The states we looked at actually had pretty varying policies on third-party ownership, and that's part of why we just decided to do what we call first-party ownership for all systems.
Okay, great. So I just want to ask this myself. I want to make sure I understood you. Did you say that with net metering, there's never an incentive to invest in a battery, or did I misunderstand?
No, you heard me right. So what we found is that with net metering and that kind of export compensation, there's because you're paid a given price for sending power back to the grid anytime, regardless of system load or other system constraints, there's no incentive for you to better manage your power. There's an incentive for you to treat the grid like a battery. And so in all 5 geographies, and both with residential and commercial customers, offering export compensation through net metering drastically decreases the economic value of a battery, such that particularly for residential customers, it almost never makes economic sense to have a battery if you're offered net metering.
Now, there's a big but there, Todd, and that is, so it doesn't make sense under that one rate structure. However, if in one of those cases, let's say the New York case, those batteries were allowed to provide any number of those 13 services that I was presenting on, then there might be an economic case to be made to put those batteries alongside that PV system. But like Leia said, right now, the value prop of putting PV out there is largely driven by net energy metering. So there's just very little incentive to put those batteries out there unless that changes, or we have some of these regulatory changes that would allow batteries to deliver other services.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate the caveat because we're seeing systems being installed in PJM for the express purpose of ancillary service provision, and in certain cities for the express purpose of demand charge reduction. And so those are both benefits that you really aren't able to do through just solar with net metering. You really have to have a storage device to provide those services, and obviously those are economic propositions, at least in some areas. So I wanted to make that distinction. When you said with net metering there's never an incentive for a battery, you weren't considering other uses for the battery, in other words.
That's right, and like Jesse said, in their analysis, they didn't put a value on backup power. There's absolutely scenarios where if a customer values backup power or they have an opportunity, like in PJM, to earn a revenue stream from something like frequency regulation, in those instances, yes, there's probably an economic case for a battery, but we didn't consider any of those opportunities in our particular analysis.
Right, and that was the other thing I wanted to follow up on. I understand that, it's difficult. I mean, to my knowledge, nobody has actually calculated a value for resiliency, and it would be different for different types of facilities. But have you considered, or did you, have you given, I guess, any thought to assigning a value for resiliency? I'm just curious.
We haven't put anything out. For example, in the economics of battery storage paper, we're not going to be including an appendix that goes into detail on different ways folks have gone about calculating the value of backup power. So it's just not something that's in our wheelhouse right now. I know there is some good work being done on that. We'd like to dig on it into it in the future, but as Leia said, and Todd, as you know, there's just a number of variables, and so we don't have any numbers we can pull out offhand.
Okay. Can you guys stay on for another, say, 5 minutes? We still have a bunch of questions, and I do understand if you need to get off now, but if you can stay on, I'd love to ask a couple more questions.
I can.
Sure,
okay.
I can stay for 5.
Okay, good enough. Thank you. Somebody wanted to know if you considered the best use of battery chemistry type in the specific processes. In other words, did you just use a standard, say, lithium-ion battery for all your calculations, or did you consider the advantages or disadvantages of changing that?
Very good point. That's pretty simple. So for our report, and Leia, correct me if I'm wrong, for load defection, it was all lithium-ion batteries. Now, for the Economics of Energy Storage report, we completely recognize that might not be the most effective solution. As I showed with this case in New York, that's a 6-hour window where batteries need to be discharging in order for the distribution circuit to not overload. That's a huge window for lithium-ion batteries to be serving. And because it's such a big window, the economics for that system don't work out. So that might be a case where actually a hybrid battery design makes more sense, where you're using something like a distribution-connected flow battery to serve that 6-hour window, and then smaller distributed lithium-ion batteries to serve the more power-focused applications. So for our analysis, we use lithium-ion, but we absolutely recognize that hybrid designs or just other chemistries, period, have their places too.
Great. Somebody wants you to repeat where they can find the eLab Accelerator boot camp.
Sure. Absolutely. The web address is www.rmi.org/elab_accelerator.
Great, and I think we've got that on screen now. Well, no.
Yeah, it's getting a little cut off in the visual. It's underneath the date.
Okay. So I think that's going to have to do it for today. I apologize to those folks who didn't get their questions asked and answered, but we are out of time. And I want to thank our presenters very much. This presentation will be archived on our website and can be reviewed. And Samantha, you want to talk about briefly a couple of upcoming webinars?
Sure. We have a few upcoming webinars. The next is on next Thursday, and our topic is electricity markets and the economics of energy storage. And after that, we have 2 webinars scheduled so far in September around the topic of resilient power. On September 9th, we have a webinar, Fuel Cells for Wastewater Treatment Plants, and then we're starting a series of energy storage market updates, the first of which will take place on Wednesday, September 30th. And all of our webinars are free, and you can find information on those on our website, which is resilient-power.org.
Great, and that electricity markets and the economics of energy storage webinar on the 27th of August really cues up the market update series that starts at the end of September. So we hope that folks will be able to attend that August 27th webinar if you're interested in the market update series, which will look at ancillary services markets and other value streams that solar and storage can access. So thanks again to everybody, and any last words before we sign off here? Okay. Sign up on the distribution list if you would like to get notices for future webinars and our monthly free Resilient Power Project newsletter. Thanks again to Leia and Jesse for excellent presentations. We'll see you all next time.